Good morning, everyone. I sure had been hoping that I'd get back from vacation and I would be with you in person. But because life is what it is these days, I have to preach to you and share with you and be with you remotely. And I ask just that you pray that Amy and my test results come back in a good way so that we can be with you again next Sunday. The gospel reading for this Sunday is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 1 through 9, and then 18 through 23. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." And then he goes on to explain the parable. "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches it away, what was sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. For what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble and persecution arises on the account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what is sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of this world and the lures of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as what is sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields. In one case 100-fold, in another 60, and another 30. Let us pray. Lord, let the words of my mouth, but more importantly, the meditation of each precious heart, be open to hearing the seeds of your truth, and let them grow in the good soils of their hearts. May we be open and receptive to you, O Lord, the divine and truthful sower. Amen. Do you remember the story of the city mouse and the country mouse? Well, I grew up pretty much a city mouse. I may have been born in the country and raised in rural Idaho across the road from soybean fields and potato patches and asparagus growing in the irrigation ditches. But my dad was a preacher and a one-room school teacher, and my mother was a nurse on hiatus, raising my sister and I. I may have thought of myself as a country mouse, but the reality was spending one's life or part of one's life in the country does not make one an expert on farming, on country living. I learned that when I married a truly country mouse. My idea of farming was that of just planting a bigger garden and using bigger tools. I began to understand growing more crops after watching Adam study the soil in our fields. I watched as he calculated the nutrients that would possibly be available in the soil because of what was growing in it years earlier. He would survey the rocky parts and portions of the field, scratching his head, and he always would say that only that dirt could grow rocks. And by the way, the city girl didn't understand that until several seasons later of picking up rocks and feeling like there was more dirt there, only to see that the earth's crust and motion was constantly working more rocks to the surface. And then he taught me not to plow through patches of bindweed, because he said, this stuff you just can't kill, and you don't want to drag remnants of the plants and the seeds into the good part of the field. I watched as Adam would evaluate all of these different things about dirt. And then he worked at calculating just how many pounds of seed per acre he should plant. There was so much to this farming thing. And I guess that's why I like the ranching part better. Because caring for livestock was a lot more like caring for kids, and I understood that. The lesson I learned about farming is this. Farming is less about planting seeds as it is understanding the soil and the sower. This little parable of Jesus got me thinking about soil. Jesus isn't talking about the growth of seeds that he plants into our hearts. Jesus is telling us to take a good look at the soil of our hearts, the conditions of our hearts and our minds and our actions. Dirt isn't just dirt. And if you're a farmer, you're going to want to know the compounds and the nutrients and the organic matter that are going to be found in your land so that the seeds will mature and grow. And I believe that's part of what Jesus is telling us. But he's also talking about the sower who scatters the seeds. And this sower sows them rather indiscriminately, and it seems like maybe he didn't know to do a soil analysis, because some of those seeds landed on foot-worn paths, while others fell on soil that was either not deep enough or was infested with weeds. And that yield was disappointing. As a matter of fact, in this parable, it sounds like there was no profit at all. What we have to keep in mind, of course, is that this is a parable. And as much as it may seem like Jesus was giving a few pointers on agriculture and lessons in farming, he is really not. And if we were to read further, we would see that Jesus' disciples picked up on this, and they weren't getting it. They said, what are you talking about? Why do you speak to other people in parables, it says in verse 10. And what he tells us, what Jesus told them, may surprise us. When I was young, I was told that parables were everyday little illustrations that Jesus used to help his listeners understand what he was really trying to get at. But that's not what Jesus says at all. He doesn't use parables so people will understand. He actually tells people parables that don't make much sense. They always don't quite get it. But Jesus tells these earthly stories with heavenly meanings so that you and I will start thinking and figuring out Christ's truths in our own individual lives and for ourselves. Parables are to push us outside of our box and our thinking so the seeds of God's truth can grow and take deep root within our hearts and our minds and our actions of life. Jesus says to his disciples in verse 11, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom, but to them it has not been given." In other words, you got the ability. You've been around me long enough. Think about these stories and find these truths. Do you get it? But to those out there who haven't been around me like you have, they're not going to get it. And so therefore, these parables are given to stretch them and to help them come to know me and God on a personal level. When we read on a little further in this chapter, we discover that Jesus does explain this parable of the sowers. He tells his disciples his seemingly innocent lessons on what planting really means so that they maybe can go, aha, I think I'm getting it a little bit better. So what we have here in Matthew chapter 13 is the first of Jesus's parables. And then we have him giving an explanation of this parable. And Jesus also discloses the meanings so that we can then hear his words and hear the seeds of God's truth and understand that we are to let them grow in our own lives as we dig deeper into the rich soil of our own hearts as nurtured by the Spirit. There's a condition of the heart that's represented in this parable by the good soil. And that is when we let the Spirit of God nurture those thorny places and unpack that packed down ground of attitudes so that God's truth can be planted deeply into our meaning of life. And it will have a lasting effect on how we are Christ-like in our attitudes and our actions. So what is this necessary condition and why is it so necessary? Whatever it is symbolized for us as good soil into which some of the seeds of God's truth is sown. And when that happens, the result is good things happen from us. They grow from us. God's truth grows and is bountiful within us. Just from what we know so far, how would you describe the soil of your heart? Is it good soil? Do you have all four soils in your heart? And if so, how can we make and change that soil of our hearts to become good soil? One way to arrive at that answer is to contrast good soil with the other types of soil that we find in this parable. So let's start to do that. And let's start with the soil on the path. Jesus says, as the sower sowed, some seeds fell upon the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Jesus says here that if we have foot-worn, hard-packed soil that's so dense, seeds can't penetrate it. And that means that if we have stubborn hearts and hardness of hearts, hearts that are unable to reason outside themselves, that the evil one can pick it up and eat it. It means that it's not the good soil. It's not soil that can be tilled. It's not soil that seeds can enter into with no problem. It means it's a heart that is not open to differences and tolerate others' truths. It means that we have trouble understanding what it means to even be Christ-like. Jesus is not describing different types of soil or circumstances in life. He's describing our inner being, who we truly are at our core. And these are various landscapes of the human heart. We have met these in others, but we often have trouble discovering them inside ourselves. We are rarely just one type of soil. We are almost always a combination of all four. The four soils are descriptive of how we live and we relate to others and to God. Hard hearts, like described earlier. Rocky heart, soil that is receptive to God's truth as long as it can survive within the shallow human reasoning that we cling to. And hot hearts, hot-headed attitudes that scorch and wither God's truth and melt them into our narrow views. And thorny hearts that choke out God's seeds of truth that don't fit into our world views of what God's truth should be and should look like. In Jesus' interpretation of the parable, he tells us what happens to the seeds and describes the consequences of God's truth not taking root into our lives and our beings. But in this parable, that is just one lesson in farming that we are to hear, that we are to realize, that to be self-reflective, and that we are to examine what kind of life we are living, to figure out the different places and different soils of our heart that are either taking in these truths and growing from them, or are stifling these truths and killing out the potential of God's grace in our lives and the lives of those around us. So we can't stop there, because that's not all that this parable is about. Jesus has another lesson in farming for us. I believe that he is trying to tell us that we live in a world that thrives on competition and comparison and judgment. So we reduce the parable to just one obvious question. We ask ourselves, okay, what kind of dirt are we? And we put ourselves in the center of this parable and push the sower into the background. We push God away from trying to help us determine the soil of our hearts, to help us reflect on who we really are. The what kind of dirt are you and I question is not the only lesson in farming that we are to hear. But we are to hear the heavenly meanings of this earthly story are also about the sower. Our seeds of truth that God, the divine sower, is sowing into each of us. A while back, I read a story written by Father Michael Marsh, who is an Episcopal priest in East Texas. This is a story I think teaches me a lesson about the farmer, about God as the divine sower, and how that changes our outlook and our ability to see God's truth in the midst of all the chaos of the world. Father Marsh shares his story. He says, I spent a couple days in Selma, Alabama, and I stopped at a gas station at the edge of town to fill up before heading towards home. I went inside and I walked over to the cashier to pay. On the other side of the office, an elderly black man was sitting in a chair against the wall. And I looked at him and I said, hello. And he just nodded and said, boss? He called me boss. And then he said, 40 cents a day. I plowed them fields, boss. 40 cents a day. Then he got louder. 40 cents a day, I tell you. 40 cents, boss. And then he got out his wallet and he held up 2 $1 bills. And he began waving them in the air and he said, this is 5 days of my life, boss. 40 cents a day. At 40 cents a day. Marsh continues and said, I was filled with lots of thoughts and questions and feelings, and some of them weren't very good. So I mostly kept silent, really not knowing what to do, what to think, or what to feel. But I have thought about this elderly man a lot since that day I met him. After thinking about this encounter and taking it out of the context of my reason and my experiences and my attitudes and putting it in the light of Jesus' parable of the sower, it made me think about the ground on which this elderly man most likely had walked, and not about his reactions and how they made me feel or think. Instead, I suspected he often walked the hard-packed path of prejudice, a path where not much grew, where life and opportunities were too quickly snatched away. I thought, I'll bet he knew what it was like to live between a rock and a hard place, on the rocky ground where life withers because you can't put down decent roots, because there's no security or stability, and it feels like the heat of life just scorches it out. And I'll bet he surely walked among the thorns of violence and fear, anger and poverty. And I have no doubt, he says, that those thorns wrap themselves around him and his family, choking away dignity, security, and trust. And yet, Marsh says, no, because I know the divine sower. I hope that the best soil he walked through was not the 40 cent a day soil he plowed. Wasn't his ordinary life. But instead, I hope he stood in that dark, rich soil that can always nourish our life no matter where we are, with love and hope. We may not have plowed fields for 40 cents a day, but we all know the different landscapes of which Jesus is talking about. We know and have experienced a beaten path of life. We've stumbled through those rocky patches in life, and we have scratched and been cut by the thorniness of life. And yet it is my fervent prayer that even in the midst of all of these realities, we have been planting our roots deep in that sacred soil of God's truth that will feed and grow in us and become a harvest of sharing God's goodness and truth. Confident that God is throwing his seeds of truth and love everywhere, and that we can help in our Christ-like actions and understandings to produce his love, his mercy, his grace 100-fold or 60-fold. Maybe even 30-fold. You see, when we hear the lessons of Christ's parables through the lens of our worldview, the result is that we won't hear understanding. We will see earthly things, but we will not perceive heavenly truths. A farmer goes out and sows seeds on a public pathway, on rocky ground and amongst thorns. That makes no sense. That's wasteful, inefficient, and ineffective farming. It's bad farming. These lessons in farming don't make earthly sense, but that's because we're not open to seeing them through the divine sower's eyes. You see, the divine sower isn't much of a farmer. You can't plant seeds among the rocks and the thorns and then complain nothing grows. Instead, the divine sower knows the potential of the deep, dark dirt each of these places can become when they're open to the truth of his Spirit. The lesson in farming, Jesus tells us, doesn't fit into our world, but it fits into the heavenly meanings that will help us understand this parable and all of Jesus' parables for the enriching of this life. Because parables offer a different perspective, a new worldview. They give us a glimpse into God's world and what God is like. They heal our ears and our eyes so that we might hear and see and understand and perceive all things in life through Christ's like heart. Parables are not meant to test our human intelligence. They are lessons of grace that test our heart's willingness to surrender and to be surrounded in the always surprising generosity and love of God. And the surprising generosity of God is exactly what the parable of the sower reveals. As different as the four soils are, they hold two things in common: the seeds and the generous sower. The sower sows the same seeds of truth in all four soils with equal toil and equal hope and equal generosity. The sower does so without evaluation of the soul's quality or potential. There is no soil left without seeds, without hope, without the potential. No ground is declared undeserving of God's seeds of truth. The lesson in farming is not about understanding the quality of the dirt. Rather, this part of the lesson is about the equality of God, the divine sower. who wants all to come to the knowledge of his truth, regardless of the condition of anyone's heart. We may want to judge what kind of dirt we are, or it's easier even for us to judge the dirt we think is in other people's hearts. But it's useless if we don't hear that God simply wants to sow his life, his truth into everyone's life, and that we are able to acknowledge this truth and grow accordingly. Whether we are 40 cents a day soil or $400 a day soil, we are all sown with the seeds of God's truth. No life, no person, no soil is left unsown. Seeds here and seeds there. God's seeds are everywhere. And we are to be nurturers, not only of our own heart soil, but also to be encouragers and nurturers of the good soil that can be in anyone's heart. And even though our worldly views may see God as a poor planner, and by earthly terms and reasons in today's economy, God may seem wasteful. And by today's farming practices, God seems inefficient. And with the cost of seeds and the time spent in our human reason, God doesn't seem very profitable. The lesson of farming is this: the profitability is not our concern. It's the divine sower's concern. And thankfully, this parable is about God's faithfulness and not about literal farming, soil quality, or how things work in this world. For what the world views of the sower is wasteful. But the heavenly truth is that God's wastefulness plants seeds that give way to hope, to love, to generosity, and to grace. Every part of our life has been sown with seeds of God, and you know what happens to seeds, right? When we give our hearts in to the right conditions, apple seeds become apples, peach seeds become peaches, and God's seeds become God. This morning, did you hear a lesson in farming for your life? For what you can grow and give to others? Hear then the parable of the sower. Amen.